My first introduction to the Dodo was in 1973, freshly arrived from Italy to start my DPhil. And it was not in this museum, Paul, I'm afraid, but it was a sentence I read on the back of the Mathematics Institute here in St. Giles. It was a huge, gigantic writing, the only remnant of 68 in Oxford. And the sentence says, "You are all dodos," for the professors to look at. Then I learned a bit more, and I worked on the dodo a lot for reasons that will become clear now. What I'm going to say now is a homage to species of intellectuals who were not as lucky as the dodo. They did not survive. In fact, they were actively killed by skilled owners of scientific truth, but they existed nevertheless. And the dodo has a place in the history of evolution, broadly understood. A place that justifies the reasons why the famous French anatomist Cuvier came here to Oxford in 1830 to study the bones, and why Richard Owen in London started to work systematically on the dodo, and why a man called Hugh Strickland in 1848 published the first systematic study on the dodo. The chap that has been completely forgotten, I think, is this young man here with an extraordinary name, Jean-Baptiste Geneviève Marcelin Bory de Saint-Vincent. It's all France, and we probably should think about our French friends now. But he's here in his old age, but the previous slide is when he goes on a trip together with Captain Baudin. That is the Baudin expedition. 2 ships that they go to Australia. They even meet Captain Flinders, they exchange civilities, and in spite of the war between England and France, British authorities help the expedition of Captain Baudin. Here is a view of Tenerife taken by Bory, who was a very good draftsman. And here I stole a slide from Paul to remind you where these islands are, the Mascareignes Islands. And Bory concentrated on the Île-de-France, which is Mauritius. Maurice, called by the indigenous populations, the French indigenous population, Mauritius after 1810, when the British troops invaded it. And then in 1814 and 1815, with the settlement of Europe, Mauritius became part of the British Empire. In 1801, Bory jumps ship, and together with another 11 naturalists, they were all young enthusiasts. They wanted to see the world, but they underestimated how hard it is to live on a ship, and so they took the first chance to abandon it. And Bory remained there for almost 1 year, but he spent an entire month in Mauritius. He wrote about it in 1804 in a book called Voyage dans les 4 principales îles de mer d'Afrique. And there is a long chapter in volume 3 in which explains how the dodo plays a fundamental role in a materialistic history of the earth and of life. We are not within our evolutionary frame of reference, but we are within a common evolutionary frames of reference at the time, which later evolutionists and certain historians have decided to completely neglect. Which is the reasoning of Bory de Saint-Vincent? It's very simple. He goes to describe how Mauritius is not even a pinhead, is the point of a pin in the oceans. He examines the likelihood that forms of life are taken there by ships or by gales. And he says some yes, others not. And he elaborates a very successful theory, is one among many, who believed that life is a kind of Lego puzzle, is a combination of chemical molecules that combine and recombine, and once you have life molecules active, then you have going up the ladder of complexity. However, he says, in Mauritius, what happened was that the island is relatively young, and the dodo bear the marks of the haste with which nature tried to create life. And so he examines, for instance, the fact that on Mauritius there are a lot of polymorphic and dimorphic plants. And that means that is plants that have great differences in their parts, to the point that botanists have thought they were different species. No, they are the same species. Boris says, well, the dodo is exactly the same. That is, it's a nature that tries quickly to build up the Lego of life, the great combinations. And he had a good teacher there, because of course we are also, in this age of global history, the only people we don't work on are the people who were there before. And here is the teacher of Boris in La Réunion, which is still French territory, Joseph Hubert, who was a naturalist, second generation born, who was there and was extremely active in the acclimatization of pepper plants and other spices in order to break the monopoly of the Dutch, which they succeeded in doing. So it is interesting that Boris is never mentioned in the huge literature on the dodo, but simply referred to as a traveler who mentioned the dodo. Well, he was much more than that. But let's jump another 20 years. He publishes, from 1822, Boris is the editor of a Dictionnaire classique d'histoire naturelle, classical dictionary of natural history. You may be more interested if I tell you that that is the only dictionary that travels with Darwin in his cabin on the Beagle, the only one. And it is a dictionary which is the summary of non-Lamarckian and non-Darwinian evolutionary theories. Of course, they could not be Darwinian because Darwin is not yet there. But certainly it is very interesting work, which I read several times over. And there is an article called Création, Creation, in which the same arguments that I told you about are repeated. These animals cannot have come here from nowhere because it doesn't exist anywhere. Could it have come from Madagascar or from Africa? It could, but there are none of these kind of birds there. So it must have been produced on the island, which means that nature is extremely active in producing lives, forms of life, even sophisticated one. Now, is this just a French story? Well, it is not. Let me just finish the French story with one thing. The famous Cuvier knew Boris very well and hated him. And Boris wrote several times attacking Cuvier and saying Cuvier is blocking the advancement of science with his unreasonable creationism. But in 1830, life changes the situation. 1829, in fact, a school friend of Boris becomes the most powerful man in France, the Marquis de Martignac. And this Marquis, charges Boris to become the head of a big natural history expedition that France is organizing in Greece. Now Cuvier has to make terms with this man, and they meet every week to discuss this plan. It is Boris' highest point of notoriety in Europe. The Dictionnaire classique is translated into Italian. It is commented in Spanish newspapers, in German magazines. It is known everywhere. How does it cross the channel? Very easily. First of all, Dictionnaire classique, as I said, was traveling in Darwin's ship, but also a famous literary person, John Wilson, also called Christopher North, a famous commentator and writer from Edinburgh, reviewed Boris de Saint-Vincent theories in the influential Edinburgh Review. And rather sympathetically, I'm not going to read that, you may read that if you want, but Wilson catches the point. Is nature, in fact, still active in producing life? Isn't the dodo telling us this story? Or isn't Boris telling us this story of the dodo that tells us this story? Is it finished there? It is not finished there. Because John Wilson or Christopher North, who writes hundreds of articles for the press because he's very rich, then his uncle loses all the money, so he has to work like crazy to write for magazines, and that's what he does. And he reviews also the book I mentioned before by Strickland. What had happened in between, I already mentioned. Cuvier comes to Oxford in 1830 to look at the bones to see whether something could be done. He is sure that it cannot be what Boris says, a single bird somewhere lost in the Indian Ocean. So it must be worked out. He doesn't continue the work, he dies in 1832. But Richard Owen, a famous conservative, extremely good anatomist in London, also called the British Cuvier, takes on and starts working on the families this funny and nice-looking Donald Duck pigeon was part of. And then, of course, Strickland, who died in one of the earliest nasty railways accidents, is doing the geology of a cut, of a train cut, and he sees a train coming, so he moves on the other rail, but another train is coming from the other direction, and is not as lucky as the dodo, and Strickland died. But Wilson writes a review of that, and look here what he does. He puts together the Galapagos and the dodo. That is, Wilson, quoting Strickland, now says, well, maybe what we know now, we can say that there were a lot of birds-like forms, like the dodo, in that huge area. And they adapted to different environments, a bit like in the Galapagos, where birds, reptiles, and tortoises, and iguanas, iguanas are reptiles, are coming from the continent, but they have adapted each to each island, forming new species. I'm not saying that that is following the steps of Darwin. I simply say that this kind of stories cannot be forgotten simply because we are eliminating entire part of the history of, for instance, evolution, only in order to please people like Cuvier and later on Owen, who denied that the dodo was interesting, not only as a lost bird, but also as a chapter in the history of life. Thank you.